ready.
Okay.
Great. Good evening. I'm Rob Fleener. I've been a resident of Leucadia for 44 years. On behalf of NOWLeucadia, I would like to welcome you all to the first of our mayoral interviews. This Zoom is being recorded, and it is our intention to post the recordings on our NOWLeucadia website after the fourth mayoral interview. At this time, we would like to ask you all to please mute and stop your video until the question and answer period. Questions should be written in the chat column, and those not addressed by the candidate during our interview will be presented in the open question period. Our future 3 interviews will be on Zoom with the same limited capacity. If you do not wish to participate in the remaining 3 interviews, please send an email letting us know. Otherwise, you will remain on our attendee list. For those of you not familiar with NOWLeucadia, we are a volunteer organization started by a few neighbors, hoping to influence the city to give us safe rail crossings in Northwest Leucadia. The goal of NOW is to help keep our neighborhoods informed about city issues. We would love to have more of you involved. Please go to our website and sign up. Find us on Facebook or Instagram, or refer to the chat room where you can find all of this info. Thank you, and now I'll turn the meeting over to Michael, who will conduct the candidate interview.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. So hello, everyone. My name is Michael Murray. I'm also a resident of Northwest Leucadia and a member of NOWLeucadia. I will be conducting the interviews that we're having, as Rob mentioned, the next couple of Tuesdays. We're essentially meeting with all the different mayoral candidates. Tonight, we're planning on about 45 minutes with some room for questions at the end. So if you have questions, please submit them in the chat window. And we're just going to sort of process those in the order in which they come. And tonight we have the pleasure of speaking with Tony. Tony Kranz. Tony, I'd like to start by thanking you for taking the time and making the effort to speak with us. We appreciate it. I think we'll get started by giving you an opportunity to just introduce yourself, and then from there we can kind of go into some of the questions that we have.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to address the NOWLeucadia group. And as mentioned, my name is Tony Kranz, and I'm working to earn your vote to become the next mayor of Encinitas. For the last 10 years, I've had the honor of serving on the city council, which has provided valuable experience for serving as mayor. Over 60 years ago, my parents brought me to Encinitas as a tiny baby, and I grew up in a place that was known then as the flower capital of the world. I lived across the street from greenhouses on Ocean View Avenue and attended all the local schools, graduating from San Diego in 1977. I played 2 years of football at Palomar College and then went to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, studying printing and graphic design, which is the industry I now work in. My involvement in city business started with trying to slow traffic down on Hygeia, where we live in the house my wife grew up in. I was involved in advocating for the roundabouts on Leucadia Boulevard, the 101 Streetscape project, and improvements to the railroad corridor, including at-grade crossings. These interests got me involved with the Leucadia Town Council, and I became a board member. I also served on the board of the Encinitas Historical Society and the San Diego Academy Athletic Council, where my 3 kids attended high school. Encinitas is incredibly popular because we have a great city. We need to work together to keep the beach community vibe while also contending with the crowds that come to visit. I would do all I can to address the challenges of growth while staying true to my roots.
Excellent. Thank you. So we'll go from, I think that was very clear. Thank you. I appreciate your attention to detail there. We'll start with, we've got a couple of questions that are essentially start with some general ones about Encinitas and then go into some more specific things for Leucadia. So the first question that we have is, what is your vision for Encinitas, both short-term and long-term?
Well, I think the long-term is, going to be driven by what we do on the short term. We have some long overdue projects that we've been working on, that we did get built this last couple of years, the undercrossing at El Portal, the first segment of streetscape. And I'm very proud of those infrastructure projects. I think that, we want to make sure that we continue to be a great place to live. And the way we can do that is by striving to improve our quality of life. And I think the biggest complaint that we get right now has to do with traffic impacts. And so trying to address how we can calm traffic, make the roads safer to bike and walk on or along is an important part of that. And for the last 10 years, we've been quite focused on accomplishing those goals.
Okay, good, thank you. Could you speak to prioritizing the top 3 issues that you think, or challenges, however you want to phrase that, that you think the city of Encinitas will face?
Yeah, well, there's no question that the housing element update has been a significant impact to our community. The multifamily housing projects that are coming out of that are going to exacerbate some of the traffic issues that we're talking about, which makes it that much more important that we continue to stay focused on that. So lately, of course, we've been struggling with issues related to homelessness. We have that problem. The region has the problem,
Right.
The state has the problem, the nation has the problem. So we find ourselves in the same situation as most, which is, how best to address those people who prefer to live on the streets.
Yeah.
And to try and get the help that they need to get off the streets. So housing and homelessness are kind of a combined issue that we need to address in the next couple of years. And we'll continue to work on the legacy infrastructure issues. 100-year-old Highway 101 is being updated to become more of a complete street. We've got a rail corridor that's over 130 years old that, has bisected our community that needs to have more crossings. We'll be working on that. And then, the climate crisis that we find ourselves in, we have adopted a climate action plan that is one of the best in the county, and we will continue to pursue achieving the goals that we laid out in that. So those are the things that I think are the citywide challenges that
Great.
we're going to be addressing.
Good, thank you. And then if elected, could you speak to maybe the top 3 projects that you would sort of champion, for lack of a better term?
Well, a lot of it is, kind of picking up and continuing what we've been working on. I think that's perhaps the most important thing, is that we continue to make progress. We have been making progress slow, but I think we're headed in the right direction. So we will continue with a lot of the projects that are, currently on our capital improvement project list. There are new projects that we need to get in the hopper, which would involve addressing some of the challenges with circulation in other parts of the city. Most people in our town, get here and use Interstate 5 plenty. So we need to figure out how best to get traffic through those interchanges. We need to work with the state to make that happen. We need to be planning for the double tracking of the segment from the transit center downtown north to La Costa Avenue.
Okay.
I'm not in a hurry to see that double tracked because I think it's going to be a significant impact, but it is, definitely in the plans. And so the more engaged we get on that particular issue, I think the better prepared we will be and the more input that we will have. So that's very important. And we have some specific plans, which are, it's maybe a little wonky, but we have documents that determine how our downtown and NOWLeucadia 101 corridors can be developed. And they are documents that are about 30 and 20 years old. And I think that it would be in the best interest of our city to take a look at whether there are parts of those documents that need updating.
Okay. What would you call that last one?
Specific planning updates.
Okay.
Yep. And we're doing some specific planning now for the El Camino Real corridor. It will be the first time we have that. But these are important documents. There's a Cardiff specific plan. It's a little newer and it was a little simpler. But the downtown and the North 101 specific plans are the oldest documents in the city and could use
some update. Okay.
Yep.
And then if I can go back to the first one, you mentioned some of the current projects that are ongoing. Is there some additional clarity you could provide to that? Is that the El Camino corridor? Is that the streetscape? It's
streetscape. We've got second segment that is going to be out for bid here pretty soon. That deals with the north end.
Okay.
We're gonna most likely end up with this middle section that will be, further down the road, so to speak. And there are other things that we're doing in the city. There's some projects in other parts of town, Santa Fe Drive. These are all generally geared towards creating complete streets, which allows for the safer biking and
It's not just cars. Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, good. And then, so the sort of the final general question, if you will, about the city of Encinitas has to do with funding. So lack of funding at the city level is a chronic and limiting factor for improvements in our city. How would you address this issue?
I think we need to, gear up to pursue state, federal dollars more effectively. And part of that involves having some projects that are shovel ready. And that's an important part of this because generally speaking, the grant dollars, they have different types of grant dollars. One grant dollar, pot of money would be for planning and we should be pursuing that more aggressively. The other is for the construction, which you have to have that shovel ready project. So those are things that I think would be good for me to focus on. I have relationships and know how the system works. There's a good chance we'll have our former mayor up in the state capitol as a senator. And we have our former council member as our assembly person. So, pursuing those monies more effectively, I think is something that I will be working to do. There's also the Transnet money that we have never historically had the opportunity to get directed towards our projects because we never had a compliant housing element, and that put us at a disadvantage when competing for the grants. The reality is that the work that we just completed at El Portal and the first segment of streetscape from Marchetta to Basil Street, the cost on the crossing and the segment of streetscape was about $25 million. Of that, we paid, had in our budget approximately 21 million, and we received about $4.5 million in state grants for the undercrossing. So we did, I think, an effective job of planning and moving that project forward. It was always envisioned that it would be a phased project, but we have made the decision to go to the infrastructure bank to be able to build the northern segment. And I think that is wise because what we're seeing from the streetscape segment that we've completed is that it really enhances the traffic flow and definitely makes it safer for bicyclists and walkers.
Okay, fair enough. Would the first part of that northern streetscape part, is that the drainage stuff is the first part of it, and then
the northern segment will be roundabouts, and we'll be making the improvements to the west side of 101, and there will be a storm drain that's part of that as well.
Okay, fair enough. I know drainage obviously is an ongoing thing. Okay, good. And people are asking questions, and I'm seeing those come into the chat. So just everyone to be mindful of the fact we'll process those once we get through the general questions. And then just again, a reminder to everyone, this is being recorded. I don't hear a lot of background noise, so it sounds like everybody's being muted effectively, which is super helpful. So we'll go. Those were the four sort of general questions, if you will, about Encinitas. And so sort of in a similar vein, I guess the first question in regards to Leucadia specifically would be your vision for Northwest Leucadia, if you have one.
Well, of course, the Northwest is the gateway to our city. And, especially on the 101, we've got, people that get off at La Costa Avenue and come west to use to frequent the businesses on the 101 or go to the beach. It's really important that we create, and establish a tone, so to speak, and we're doing that with the streetscape. We need to now catch up and make improvements to La Costa Avenue, which are long overdue.
Right.
We've been working on updating our circulation element so that we can reclassify La Costa Avenue from a 4-lane collector to a 2-lane. I don't think there are very many people. I know there was one at the meeting the other night, last Thursday, that thinks it should stay a 4-lane, but pretty much everybody else at that meeting believes that it should be a 2-lane. I have always felt that change is critical, so I'm happy that we're finally getting to the point in the circulation element update to be able to reclassify that street. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of making that segment of La Costa Avenue from the freeway to 101 safer and more attractive. And we will be working in the next couple of years on getting the plans in place to do that. So I envision that area, Northwest Leucadia, as a key gateway, and want to do everything I can to beautify that.
Okay, great. And I know someone's going to ask this question if they haven't already texted it, just about the rail crossings and just accessibility to obviously for those folks. And
absolutely, cross connections in the Northwest are critical, and we're working to make those happen. My hope is that we can get the upgrades, because that double tracking of that segment is going to impact whatever it is that we do. I would hate to go overhead and then find out that we were going to be able to trench our tracks, and then we'd have this huge distance between, or maybe have to tear them down. I don't know, but my goal has been for quite some time to get at-grade crossings in, and we're in the middle of that planning and the effort to get that in front of the CPUC. So naturally, the La Costa Avenue 101 area and La Costa Avenue is the gateway, but for those of us who live here in the stretch between Leucadia Boulevard and La Costa Avenue, we need cross connectivity to be able to get to the businesses on the 101.
Yeah, agreed. Is it possible to even speculate about the timing of the double track stuff? Is that 10 years out?
It's difficult. It's hard to say. It's probably a 15-year project, maybe even 20. It's a segment of track that NCTD has studied, and they've studied the entire corridor, and they can increase the frequencies of the trains enough with that segment still being a single track. So the immediate plans for frequency on the rail corridor don't require that it gets double tracked, but eventually they're going to do that. And so the sooner we get engaged with Sandag and NCTD on that particular issue, the better.
Agreed.
In part because, let me add that, if it involves putting the tracks in a trench, that's going to be driving some of our decisions about what to do with regard to the cross connectivity.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Okay, good. And again, in a similar vein to the questions that we had for the city of Encinitas, top 3 challenges for District 1 and Northwest Leucadia. How would you address these challenges?
Well, we're looking at La Costa Avenue improvements. We need to do more work on Vulcan Avenue, slowing speeds, as well as making it more bike and pedestrian friendly. I think that the work that we've done over the years in the rail corridor, although it's not as fancy as what was built in Cardiff, I think it can be a functional rail trail. So my hope is that we can make those, we can turn the parking to be parallel instead of perpendicular, and capture some of that space to the in between the parked cars and the railroad tracks, and use that for a safer
path
and walking path. And finally, something that is legacy infrastructure, the lack thereof, is that we inherited from the county a non-existent stormwater system.
Right.
And it was always just assumed there wasn't enough rain events to make it worth the millions of dollars that
Right.
it would take to
Right.
put in new pipes. We're in the same challenges. How do you come up with the money to put in that project? But we're making progress. We've got some designs for the streetscape. We also will need to deal with the Vulcan Avenue stormwater that we see that creates those lakes adjacent to the railroad. And until we address some of that, the solutions for cross connectivity we can't use underground solutions. That's the
Right.
problem, is that the NCTD and will not tolerate flooding in these tunnels that go under the tracks.
I see. Okay, fair enough. Okay. So we've got the LOWLeucadia stuff you mentioned, Vulcan, and then infrastructure stuff. Okay, good. And let's see. So top three. So I guess it's related. Top three projects. I think I just asked you about top three challenges. So is it possible to speak to the top three projects you would champion for District 1?
Yeah, it's essentially kind of the same list.
Yep, yep.
The challenges that we have are capital improvement projects that are long overdue. Our list of needs throughout the city has always been much longer than we had the resources for. So
Right.
the challenges of making these projects happen, the cross connections, the stormwater solutions, and improvements to Vulcan are going to be something that is going to be a challenge in the years ahead. But those will be my top focus, and they have been for years now,
Yeah.
and they will continue to be.
Okay, good. Final question has to do with why you think you're the best candidate to serve as the mayor.
You really don't want somebody who's never served in government to be your mayor unless they have a significant amount of experience, and none of the other candidates have that. I have 10 years experience. I've served under 3 mayors, and I have reflected recently on the experience of serving under Teresa Barth, Kristen Gaspar, and now Catherine Blakespear. I have an approach that I think is more inclusive. I look forward to getting to having more workshops and getting more community conversations about the efforts that we make to address community concerns. So I think that Teresa Barth approached things that way, and I will go back to doing that the same way. We will likely do more strategic planning. We will have a new council no matter what. There are 2 council members that are going to be leaving us, and so it's going to be time to sit down and reestablish whatever priorities that the new council will have. And I think that having somebody lead that conversation that has the background and the historic perspective will be helpful.
Good. Okay. I think those were pretty quick. I appreciate you working through that. We've got, it looks like a pretty decent number of questions. So I can kind of start with maybe the first one, which is, how do you intend to handle the fence? And I presume what they're referring to there is the newly erected fence that's in between Leucadia and LOWLeucadia there.
The fence is going to be addressed by getting cross connections put in, and hopefully they will be at grade cross connections. The reality is that we planned our streetscape with the expectation that we would continue to be able to trespass across the tracks.
Yeah.
And that ended when NCTD got a grant to put in fence in Oceanside, Encinitas, and Del Mar. And so we need to catch up so that we have the cross connections put in and aren't fenced off between LOWLeucadia Avenue and Leucadia Boulevard.
Do you know if either Oceanside or Del Mar have they begun the process of installing fence in their corridor?
Oceanside, I think, has the fence put in.
Okay.
They finished there. There were the first one. Del Mar is the fences, in the works.
Yeah.
I haven't heard when they're going to put it in. I know there's been a lot of chatter about what happened with Sandag and the Coastal Commission, but that was more about the cross connections that they got as mitigation for the seawall that's going in at the
Okay,
base
for
of
the,
those bluffs.
okay,
But the fence is still in the works, and they will get a
Okay.
fence.
so that's in regards to the repairs that allow us to keep the track there for the time being?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, the seawall structure is intended to keep the bluff stable for approximately 25 years.
Okay,
While the planning and engineering for a tunnel somewhere is completed and raising the money. It's probably a $4 million tunnel.
oh yeah, I can imagine that's gonna take some time.
Did I say million? I meant
B,
billion.
with a big B.
Yeah. Big
Got it.
B.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so the next question has to do with the concept of sanctuary cities. So what is your view of this concept, and what impact that might have that on the increased homelessness issue and the dearth of affordable housing?
Well, there's this myth circulating that in some way we've declared Encinitas a sanctuary city, and that's not true. Encinitas is not a declared sanctuary city. So, you know, it's never been on our agenda, and it's not anything that I've ever desired to establish. So I can't see that happening anytime in the future. It's not something that I'm likely to see put on the agenda.
Do we know if there are cities in San Diego that have declared themselves as sanctuary cities?
I don't believe there are any, but you know, in the meantime, I know Encinitas has never declared
Yeah.
ourselves a sanctuary city. Encinitas did declare an emergency, a housing emergency, and that allowed us to apply for HEAP grant funding if we
Okay.
chose to do that. We never
Okay.
did that. The Jewish Family Service did do that, and they did have a grant, and that's where we ended up with the safe parking program.
Okay,
But ultimately, you know, there really isn't anything that the city has done with HEAP grant funding.
right,
You know, the pandemic, we did more with homelessness. We provided more money to the CRC. Homelessness is a critical issue throughout
throughout the
the
state,
region.
yeah, no
Yep.
question.
And
no
so we will continue to look at ways. We have adopted a homeless action plan, and you know, we'll find out. My plan is to get that on an agenda pretty soon. A 2-year anniversary of adopting that is coming up in February, and so I think that's a good time to
Okay.
you know, have it on the agenda and talk to staff and other experts, our police department, and see what more we might do in order to address some of the concerns that we all have about the
Right.
homelessness situation.
Do we know, or do you know, are there communities in North County that or I guess how Encinitas compares to some of these other communities in terms of those resources? To my mind, you mentioned the homeless parking lot. Other than the CRC, which is a separate entity entirely, are there other programs? I'm not aware of any in Encinitas, but can you speak to that, or other communities in North County that do have programs that are?
There are every city has a staff dedicated to homelessness, and there have been some documents put together that chart all the North County cities. I haven't seen it in a while, but they list all the resources that they're dedicating to the issue of homelessness. I know that we a couple of years ago when we adopted the homeless action plan, we dedicated the resources to hire a housing coordinator, and that person also had the additional duty of dealing with the issue of homelessness. Christian was hired to do that, but he has recently taken a position at the city of Carlsbad, which has a homeless and housing department that includes about 5 employees,
Wow,
and they have
okay.
a director level position.
Okay.
And so Carlsbad is investing significant resources in addressing the issue of homelessness in their city. I think one of the most important things that we can do is better coordinate with the surrounding jurisdictions so that we all have similar programs. That way, with homelessness being kind of borderless,
Mhm.
if the homeless migrate
Right.
to the
Sure.
north or to the south,
Sure.
you know, then we're all approaching it from the same direction.
Right.
I think that's important.
Good.
And I have frequently had conversations with our sheriff's captain about what more we should be doing. And he thinks that we have the right mix of of resources engaged. It's a difficult problem to solve,
Fair
and
enough.
he's doing
Yep.
everything he can.
Good. Yeah, as you say, it's anyone that's spent any time in the state of California or up the West Coast for that matter.
Yep.
So one of the questions we have here has to do with drainage in Northwest Leucadia. Will those drainage improvements that you mentioned, will that be just in the vicinity, I'm interpreting this, just in the vicinity of the new hotel, or is it along the corridor so it goes as far south as the roadside park? Do you know?
The current strategy that we have doesn't take the pipe all the way to the roadside park, but the plans show it going to about Basil Street. So the idea it would be to put the pipe in during construction of streetscape, because the current pipe runs in the railroad corridor. The new pipe would be in the Highway 101 corridor. So
Okay.
that's the plan, is as we're making improvements for streetscape, that we would also bury the pipe so that we don't come back later.
Piggyback on it, right?
Yeah, and tear it up. The plan would be to have the 24-inch pipe that currently runs there run parallel to this new, much larger pipe that would be underground there.
Okay.
And we have a contract with a consultant, Q3, and they do hydrology studies. There are the watershed is divided into 4 segments, and this part that we're talking about is the northwest segment. There's another segment that is north of Leucadia Boulevard on the east side of the tracks, which would deal with some of the flooding that we see on Hermes, because there's a bowl there. There's also a bowl up between Hymettus and Fulvia, or Aeolus, I'm sorry. And so those are very challenging to address those because of the cost involved in running a pipe, but we're going to do our best to put a plan together that might get us the opportunity to receive grants from the state. The governor, about 4 months ago, released a plan on how to deal with 10% less Colorado River water, and it included doing a better job of harvesting stormwater. So my hope is that from that strategy, we can tap into some state resources to deal with this.
Good. So, and since I know someone's going to ask this question, what would you say to somebody if they were concerned about the roadside drainage as it relates to that park? It's just, we'll continue to work on that as best you can, or can you speak to that at all?
The roadside park issue is critical. The system that we have in place where we're pumping water over the bluff is unacceptable. It's just there at this time, there are no alternatives. And so I'm doing everything that I can to come up with a solution for that. A lot of the flooding that we see at Roadside Park is because we're moving stormwater from Orpheus over to the west side of the corridor. And that fills the pipe up before the Roadside Park water can fit it.
I see.
So I have a hope that we have some plans that we designed and engineered, and they are much closer to being ready for grant funding. But it would keep the water on the east side of the railroad corridor on the east side. And that I hope will solve a lot of problems with regard to the Roadside Park and the alley, the flooding that happens there.
Sure.
So I think that there are some solutions to that, but we have work to do in order to put those plans in place.
Okay, fair enough. Good, thank you. So the next question has to do with the notion of quiet zone and undercrossings. Why aren't NCTD, Amtrak, or Arizona Eastern Railway paying for any of this?
So Amtrak probably will. They are a state-run, it's a state system, so they are likely to come with some money. We're working to have a project for them to contribute to. Recently, we were fortunate in that NCTD agreed to look at a corridor-wide quiet zone. And so that means that because Oceanside has already established a quiet zone for most of their city, it would be Carlsbad and Encinitas that would be part of that. And that's important because it allows any at-grade crossings that we have to be a part of the quiet zone. So that's important. And it's very likely that there will be greater participation from Amtrak and others in order to see that quiet zone implemented.
Okay.
But ultimately, here's the rub. And this is, I say this without any pleasure. The railroadmen got away with a lot of very generous gifts, and the way the railroad is set up disadvantages communities that
Like
are
us.
that they run through. And essentially they say, you're lucky we let you cross our tracks. This is our private property. And we've granted you easements to have Leucadia Boulevard go across. We let you build a bridge at LaCosta Avenue. Everything else, if you want to do anything different, it's up to you. And I'm not saying that's, that's crazy, frankly. The city of Encinitas has now spent $21 million to put in crossings, one at Santa Fe and one at El Portal. And there was about $1 billion in the Transnet sales tax measure that passed in 2016, but it only passed, and that billion was for quality of life improvements like grade separations and crossings. But because it only passed by 58%, it didn't make it to the 66 2/3% that was necessary in order to adopt that tax measure. So, these are all areas where cities like Encinitas shouldn't be required to come up with the money, but nobody else is volunteering it. So we have a very difficult task, which is to figure out how to pay for these things.
Fair enough.
And that's where we're at.
So, and I know people are going to ask this question, and I know there's a lot to say about the notion of placing the tracks below grade. Is it possible to just speak to that briefly? I know people are going to be asking that question, and I know people that have paid attention to that issue for a long time understand that there are topographical issues and financial issues, et cetera, but maybe you can just speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, so the city actually has spent millions of dollars studying that. They studied it in the early 2000s. And, the cost of it was just unbelievable. And they just knew that there was it wasn't going to happen. And so they ended up on this, creating grade, the grade separated crossings. And that was, I think, a reasonable approach. They're planning 4. I'd like to make it 6 by adding 3 between LaCosta Avenue and Leucadia Boulevard. But the reality is the cost is significant. And some people say, well, the federal government will pay X number of dollars and San Diego will have some and the state will have some. But the reality is that in order to get to the point where you're able to go to those government agencies and say, hey, we want some money for grade lowering the tracks, you've spent probably $10 to $20 million in, to get your plans to where they need to be in order to compete. And so the question is, do you want to spend those millions of dollars on on crossings, or do you want to, go pie in the sky and a project putting the tracks underground that probably wouldn't happen for 20 years anyways.
Yeah.
And the other thing that, I got to add on this is there's this thing called a shoe fly, and it's the railroad. It's a railroad term. They would have to figure out how they were going to divert the tracks in order to dig the trench, which means that we would either have tracks on Vulcan or we would have tracks on Highway 101, neither of which are very attractive to me. So, just the construction of a trench is, to me, the impacts on the community for the construction would hardly make it worth it. Also, Solana Beach has a trench that has slanted sides. The cost to put in concrete walls, which is what Carlsbad is looking at doing, is significantly more. And that would be necessary between LaCosta Avenue and Leucadia Boulevard. I did do a public records request to the city of Carlsbad to ask how much money they've spent on their design, and it was about 3 million. The Sandag has also spent a bunch of money on it, and their plans for trenching the tracks through the village in Carlsbad are currently on hold. There were not the votes to move to continue to budget money for that study. They're exploring some other things that they want to do with the rail corridor, including the possibility of a quiet zone.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for speaking to all that. I know with all the train stuff, obviously there's a lot to say. One of the questions we have here has to do with the timeline for, you mentioned a couple of at-grade crossings in Northwest Leucadia. Is it possible to speak to maybe that process and how long it would take?
You know, it's probably at least 2 years away. We have the study underway. It's a safety study. And what we're going to do with that safety study is a lot of the data for that is likely to come out of San Clemente, because they have at-grade crossings. They have 6 at-grade crossings, several of which are very close to each other. You know, we'll probably use the data from San Clemente that says, hey, look, at-grade crossings can be just as safe as grade separated, and we should be allowed to do that. And then we have to go to the CPUC, which is kind of hostile to adding at-grade crossings. They're more about taking out at-grade crossings. They want grade separations. So, you know, we're going to try and convince them that this is an interim solution until the double tracking is figured out. And so that's going to be our argument. The 2 years would be very aggressive, but it's desperately needed. We will need to get our state delegation to help us. We will need to get the Coastal Commission on board with helping us. We need to argue that it's a coastal access issue, and we need to get them to put some muscle behind the effort at the CPUC so that they have a better understanding of how important these crossings would be to our community.
Okay. And so if we do these at-grade, and again, these are things that I anticipate people asking, with the at-grade crossings, is it possible to speak to the impact that would have on the quiet zone? Because I know that obviously there are some people that are very interested in that.
Yeah, so the San Clemente crossings use what's known as an advanced warning system, so they don't have train horns. The quiet zone would not be impacted. What is impacted is the requirement for the railroad to sound their horn at these new at-grade crossings. So this is why so it doesn't impact Leucadia Boulevard quiet zone. But because these crossings would be more than a quarter mile away from that intersection, the trains would have a requirement to sound their horns when they're going through them, according to the current federal train horn rules. That's why we need Carlsbad to agree to put in quiet zone supplemental safety measures at Cannon Road up in Carlsbad, so that we can have the quiet zone cover the entire stretch from Cannon South to Leucadia Boulevard, and then they'll be part of the quiet zone.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I mean, with some of this stuff, is it possible to sort of parallelize some of this work so we've got some of this happening at the same time? I don't know.
Definitely, yeah. The quiet zone and crossings are working parallel to each other for sure. And it's very good that NCTD is engaged. They will, because what will happen is that the cost of the construction it will likely be much less if we're doing it, you know, all of the coastal corridor
at the same time,
the inlet corridor at the same time.
Okay, got it. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so we'll pivot a little bit. The next question we have here has to do with what will you do differently than our current mayor? Are there changes that you would wish to make?
Well, you know, I have very much enjoyed working with Catherine, but we have a different approach to, you know, the conduct of the city's business, including, you know, I'm more interested in engaging the community in a dialogue. There's a, you know, I learned a lot in the first couple of years. We had some big issues that we needed to talk about, and we went up to the community center and we had a workshop format, brought in experts and let the community give us some feedback. And so I see that approach as being one that I'm going to embrace, especially in the first year. And, you know, that is my nature. I prefer to have that conversation. As you may recall, when the safe parking program was initially proposed, I was the one vote against it. And the reason I voted against it is because I conducted a meeting of my own the Sunday before that meeting, and had a lot of people show up with some significant concerns. And I just had the sense that we needed to kind of take a pause and talk more about it. And so, you know, I voted to oppose the safe parking lot. And, you know, you know, when you look at the impacts that program had on the community, it was a cleave. There's no question there were a lot of people that really had strong opposition to that never got over the way it was adopted. So I will approach it differently with kind of that lesson in mind.
Good. Okay. I think I skipped a question here that has to do with when we can get a safe walking path along Vulcan Avenue. I know you touched on that a little bit earlier. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
I did, you know, and that is, we just applied for a grant to do the planning that would be associated with that. There are questions about what the Coastal Commission will say about the potential loss of parking when you go from perpendicular parking to parallel. And I am prepared to fight really hard to recoup some of that space that we're dedicating to
the apartments,
cars. You know, I think that making room for people to walk and bike is much more important than making room for parking more cars.
Yeah, I would hope the precedent that it exists further south on Vulcan would apply, right? That as you head into Cardiff, there are plenty of spots where parking.
Yes. And you know, the reality is, if you look at the segment of the rail corridor from Leucadia Boulevard to Encinitas Boulevard, there's virtually no parking. The parking that is being done there is being done illegally by hopping over the curb.
Right.
So what we really need to do is look at how do we move that curb to the west, make parallel parking along that stretch of Vulcan, and, you know, have that walking path between the new curb and the railroad tracks. And you know, I think that the improvements that we made at Pawlecky Central School, you know, it's just more evidence that if we build it,
they will come. Yeah,
walking and biking. Yes.
Absolutely. Good. So we have a question here about city staff. So how committed is the city, and maybe there's more you can say about this, but how committed are the city staff to getting at-grade crossings?
You know, there are it has taken a little while to get this thing rolling, and you know, I don't get to go interface directly with staff. That's not the role of a council member. I work with the city manager, and then the city manager manages her staff. But we're making progress now, and I think Jill, who runs, she's the city engineer, has embraced this. And we will see. Matt Wadelski is also on the team, and most importantly, we've got a very good, very strong consultant on board. Rail Pros has a team that has quite a bit of experience, not only in at-grade crossings, but also in quiet zones. And so we're very fortunate to have them working on this to address the issues that we need to take up with the CPUC. So I think we're making progress. I am very frustrated how long it took to get rolling. And I think that there were some key people that maybe made it that way, and they're no longer with the city. So we're making more progress now.
Okay, good. I know we've got quite a few, there's a bunch of questions. We'll just, for everybody that's on the call, I'll try to work through these. And if I'm skipping over your question, it's not that I don't see it. I'm trying to pay attention to Tony and read these. And if somebody's already touched on the question or it fits into a broader question, I'm doing the best I can here. So there's a question here just about infrastructure investment in Cardiff relative to Leucadia. Obviously, that's something that lots of people feel strongly about. Can you speak to that as to why you think that, or maybe provide some context for it?
Yeah, let me provide context for it. When the planning for the work that was just recently completed on Interstate 5, including the bridge over at Manchester, over Manchester and over the lagoon, that's a program called Build NCC. And when the Public Works plan was being put together for that, State Senator Chris Kehoe wrote a bill that required Sandag and Caltrans to do all the work through the lagoon at the same time. So the double tracking project that was planned for the railroad corridor and the bike facility, which is the Coastal Rail Trail, were all advanced along with the Build NCC freeway widening project. And so all of the money that went into the Coastal Rail Trail in Cardiff was provided by Sandag and Caltrans. The only money that went into that whole project was $700,000 from the city, was $700,000 for the 2 extra gates that were required in order to create a quiet zone at Chesterfield. So of the many millions of dollars that went into that, the city put in $700,000. And that is the only way it could be built, because that was about $10 million worth of Coastal Rail Trail, the bike facility, and the rest of the work was huge. The railroad work, NCD didn't pay for that. It was about $100 million worth of railroad work. So, you know, and that basically double tracked the entire length from E Street in downtown to Solana Beach train station. And so that part of the double tracking in the region is complete. But I know there's this myth that somehow Mayor Blakespeare, because she lives in Cardiff, was able to get, you know, the city to build all these projects. But the reality is that all of that was done by Sandag, and it was all begun well before she was on the Sandag board. So she and I actually participated quite a bit in, we had meetings every other week with Sandag and Caltrans in order to keep the project moving and address any concerns that may have come up during the construction. But the reality is that the resources that went into that were not city resources. They were all state and Transnet taxes.
Okay. Yeah, as you can imagine, I think especially people that live in Leucadia are going to feel somewhat sensitive to this, because it's a good point that there's some other factors at play that have, and at the end of the day, the cash is what allows everything to happen. And
well,
how do you, sorry. No,
go ahead, ask your question.
I was just going to say how you see yourself, because certainly that's an important consideration in understanding, you know, how to manage the different sort of, you know, pressures from the different communities, right? That's definitely something that I think people in Leucadia are acutely aware of, right?
Yeah, you know, look, I've been here since '60, and I grew up just to the south of Union Street, and I used to see the Encinitas sign at the cul-de-sac of Union on the freeway, and I lived in Encinitas, and I was glad. I didn't want to be one of those Leucadians, you know. I know the parochialism of our community. We have a lot of pride, and now I'm quite happy to be a Leucadian because you know, I live on a property that has a glass blowing factory, and it speaks to the tremendous history that we have in our community of artists and kind of free spirit people. And so I'm proud of being a Leucadian. But in this job on the city council, you have to do things. First of all, you need 3 votes. So whatever it is that you're proposing or want done, you have to find allies. So this is a job that requires some give and take. And, you know, I think that I'm very proud of the fact that even though it's not as nice as the Coastal Rail Trail in Cardiff, we made improvements to the area where people were parking from Leucadia Boulevard to Acosta Avenue. And as you may recall, we did it in 2 parts because the $1 million+ that we got the first time only got us to Sanford. And so we came back with a second tranche of money, and we put in, you know, what I refer to as the poor man's Coastal Rail Trail. We paid for that ourselves. At some point, Sandag is going to come back through and make the same improvements that happened in Cardiff happen in Leucadia. And I think that the work that we're doing to kind of establish a coastal rail trail in our community is going to be very helpful when Sandag decides that they're going to, put in this coastal rail trail here in Leucadia, because they have some ideas about how it should go on the west side of the railroad corridor. I personally think that's a mistake. I think we need that sort of pedestrian and bike access on the east side of the corridor. So that's my preference. But these are the sort of things that when we get to figuring out how we're going to pay for stuff, it gets a little challenging.
Yeah,
And
fair enough.
Yep.
So, and somebody asked a question about this, but again, I think this is something that I think people will probably be interested in. Obviously, Solana Beach managed to do some of this with the tracks way back. When did they start those? In the mid 90s, late 90s? Do you have a sense for how they were able to accomplish that? I presume there was some money that came from the feds, or?
Yeah, most of it came from the feds, and back in those days that there were earmarks. And we had, you may recall, we had a Congressman, Randy Duke
Sure.
Cunningham.
Who could forget him?
He was pretty effective at, bringing the bacon home. I think that you may recall that he also was pretty effective at taking bribes.
That's right.
And
We know
spent
what
time in
happened.
prison because of that. But he got the money, and they had a mayor that was Joe Collegian that was pretty effective, and served on the Low Sand Corridor Board and was on the NCTD board. So he was effective at getting the resources. Ultimately, the problem is that, well, it's not a problem, but the reality is that Solana Beach is a very small town.
Yeah.
And the challenge we have in Encinitas is, if you were to take that same segment of track and try and figure out where in Encinitas you wanted to bury the tracks only that much, where would it be? And my thinking is that a short trench from the lagoon, Bataquitos Lagoon, up to underneath Leucadia Boulevard is the right approach. But there will be other parts of our city that will argue differently, that will say, no, we need to trench the downtown, but Encinitas Boulevard is a problem. And
right. Well, the bridge at Encinitas Boulevard is a problem, if I'm not mistaken, right? Just because of the height of it, right? So.
Correct.
Yeah,
and I would just point out that I served on the NCTD board for 10 years. I came to Encinitas with railroad fever. I wanted to see improvements to the rail corridor. I've been actively involved in all of the discussions related to the railroad pre-service on council. This has always been a passion of mine, and I have looked at this thing from 300 angles and tried. I've been racking my brain trying to figure out how to make it happen, and I think we're making progress at the at-grade crossings, and we're going to get to the point where we have that cross connectivity here in the northwest part of town.
Good. So maybe the last question, we're coming up on, I don't know if you have a hard stop at 8. We're coming up on an hour here. We'll squeeze this last question in because I think it's something people will be interested in. In light of the fact that we have the fencing in place, will the Coastal Commission still sort of have an opinion about the parking that we have, that situation that exists as you get near Leucadia Boulevard on Vulcan with all the apartment, and we know where all that overflow parking is going? Will the Coastal Commission still kind of care about the parking, given that there's now fencing and no one can access the?
All I will say is that my relationship with the Coastal Commission is pretty much zero. We have staff members that frequently meet with them, and we are moving forward with the planning for changing the parking. So that tells me that they have probably had an informal conversation that will allow for it to be addressed.
Okay.
But I'm just kind of steeling myself for the possibility that they'll have some pushback.
Okay.
But in the end, I think that we have a very strong argument. I don't think we necessarily need the Coastal Commission for that particular discussion, but I think we do need it for the CPUC and the at-grade crossings.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I guess with all that stuff, you have to make sure you have a good relationship with these people.
I'm happy to answer more questions. I don't really,
Okay.
8 o'clock is my bedtime. So if you see me nodding off, that's
I get it. I think we all suffer from that.
Yep.
Okay. So we've got, I know there are lots of people posted things. I'm doing my best to interpret these. If you posted a comment that doesn't have a question, I'm just not, I don't know how to turn that into something that I can ask Tony that gives us an opportunity and him an opportunity to sort of, extrapolate on that, right? So we talked about the Solana Beach stuff. So were pedestrian walkways included in the, and I'm guessing this applies to Vulcan in particular, were there walkways that were included in the streetscape stuff, or was that pretty, for the most part, was that west of the tracks and it didn't include any Vulcan walking?
It did
So
not. The
it didn't.
streetscape,
Okay.
the streetscape was all, exclusive to the west side of 101. That was the one accomplishment that I was able to get NCTD to agree to allowing us to encroach more into their right of way. When the conversations for streetscape first got started, their position was stay off of our right of way. You can only use
right.
what you have,
Right.
and we'll let you have bus turnouts on our right of way, but that's all. And we then, pretty quickly got to the point where they were agreeing to allow us to formalize the parking more. And so that's why you see parking pods that
Okay.
are made of DG and have an entrance and an exit and so on and so forth.
Did that come about when we assumed, and I use that collectively, the city of Encinitas assumed some liability for some of the,
We did.
okay, and that, is that what sort of enabled us, the city then to do that? Yeah.
It is. We had to accept liability. The reality is that the difference between the fence, because we did accept liability, is that the fence is closer to the tracks because we accepted liability and responsibility for the part of the railroad right of way that is between Vulcan and the current fence. If we had not assumed that liability, the fence would be right at the right of way line between the city's property and the NCTD property, which would mean there was essentially no parking on
On
in
that.
railroad
Okay.
corridor on the Vulcan side.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. I think we're in good shape. I know I apologize if any of the listeners asked a question, I didn't get to it. I'm trying to sort of multitask here, but I think we managed to get through for the most part. I mean, I think there's probably some overlap in some of this.
Can I answer Reed's question here?
Of course.
Is there a new rail crossing recently approved in Cardiff? How was that granted a higher priority than some improvement in Leucadia, especially given the imbalance of infrastructure spend? There is not a new crossing that has been approved. What we approved was applying for grant funding to build a new crossing there. There is a crossing that has been engineered and designed, and it came out of the conversation about the coastal rail trail in Cardiff and the fact that we were going to have a fence put in as part of the coastal rail trail in Cardiff. So between Santa Fe Drive and Chesterfield, there was always a plan for one more crossing. Originally, it was at Montgomery. Now it's at Verde. The approval of that won't happen until, number one, we would need the grant money to ever move forward. But that isn't going to change the work that we're doing in Leucadia to get crossings in. So
Okay.
I know that was a contentious issue. This is not a zero-sum game between Cardiff and Leucadia. We can do both. And as mayor, I will assure you that I will be working diligently to get the cross connections here in Leucadia.
Okay, good. I get that. And then the last question has to do with the Hillcrest undercrossing. Excuse me, Hillcrest. I know that was way back when the 4 undercrossings were pitched. I don't know how many years ago that was, but one of the locations was probably the northernmost location was Hillcrest. Has that, for the most part, been sort of shelved in favor of the at-grade stuff?
Yeah. So, and part of it is that if you look at the city did some cross connection study as part of the coastal mobility livability working group. We looked at how to make the rail corridor a better neighbor. And in the analysis that they did as part of that, there is a challenge with undercrossings north of Leucadia Boulevard because of the flooding issues.
Yeah.
And so when you look in the cross connection study that's available on the city website, you'll notice that all of the crossings in north of Leucadia Boulevard are above grade. And that's
Okay.
because below grade is
Is a problem.
challenging. Yeah,
Right.
it's problematic. So I think there are, if we can advance the stormwater pipe that we need on the east side of the railroad tracks along Vulcan, maybe there's a solution there. But if you look at the undercrossing in at El Portal, and you are traveling south on Vulcan, you'll see that there's a ramp that kind of
Yeah.
goes up and gets
Yeah.
to the same level as the tracks. And that's because basically the engineers created an earthen dam.
Right.
If there was severe flooding,
It's not going to end up. Yeah.
the trailer park would be 8 feet underwater.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, you know, it's before that tunnel would have any water in it. So it's obviously we won't let the
Right.
trailer park go
Fair enough.
underwater.
But I get it.
Also,
So the tunnel won't fill.
so that earthen dam is the same structure. You'd have to be doing something similar at Hillcrest, figuring out a way, how do we keep the water out of this tunnel? And I think that's a challenge. And that kind of speaks to this issue of, we need to argue that to the CPUC that these at-grade crossings are interim, that there's a lot of things that need to happen. We need to figure out the double tracking, and, you know, before we decide we're going to go overhead,
Sure.
because maybe the tracks are going to be underground there.
Right. Okay, fair enough. So we're well past an hour. I would say we can probably, if you have another minute, maybe the last comment I'll make, Tony, is just you had sort of spoken to this, just being able to advocate for both, you know, for Leucadia and other areas. I think that's probably one of the things that, you know, if you were out having a coffee and you bump into someone that says, I live in Leucadia, and they ask you why it seems like Leucadia is often on the getting the short end of the stick, or if they make some comment about that, do you have, what do you typically say to those folks? Do you say that's not happening? Yeah, sorry.
I say that, you know, there is still a lot of work to do in Leucadia, but let's keep in mind that the streetscape is part of Leucadia.
Yeah.
And there's, you know, we borrowed $20 million to complete the segment, the northern segment. And so that's a pretty big chunk of money to go into Leucadia. And it's been pointed out to me on many occasions that, you know, the majority of our residents are cut off from that by the railroad corridor not having a crossing. So I get that. And it's not enough. We have more work to do. There's no question about it. But it's, you know, the city has spent 17 years working on a streetscape plan for, you know, the city. And yes, the borderline between Encinitas and Leucadia is about, you know, North Court or Union Street. So, you know, we still haven't done much in Leucadia, but we're getting ready to do a lot more on the streetscape in Leucadia.
Good. Okay. Well, we're well past an hour. So again, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. I think everybody does. For the rest of you folks, we've got another call next Tuesday. Essentially, the next couple of Tuesdays will be kind of doing the same thing. We've got the same questions that we're posing to everyone. So it'll hopefully gives you an opportunity, and it gives, importantly, the mayoral candidates an opportunity to tell us who they are and answer questions.
Thank you all.
Thanks again, Tony. Appreciate it very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Cheers.